Alright, so this is my first attempt. Normally when I do videos like these, if I remember correctly, I'll do one where I read off the script, and then right after I'll do one just free flow, and I usually use the one after. I'm about to do this in front of people, so it's going to be a completely different circumstance than sitting by myself, so we'll see about that. But let's just practice real quick. Okay. Okay. Let's get my hands in so I can gesture properly. Infinity includes a boundary, and nothing requires a context. This is because these are both the same unit. It's represented best as the waters. I found in exploring this, like just base fundamental what has to be, while the explanation is complex, the simplest way to put it and accurate way to put it for functional reasons, I found got closer and is getting closer continually just to the description in Genesis, and reflective of the biblical text throughout. So I ended up adopting that for a lot of the phraseology, like heaven and earth. And so as I go through this, you're going to see me kind of sort of make those transitions, because they're actually more correct, 'cause I'm talking about very complex things. You know, and everything in this world actually exists as a reflection of, also so we can understand these sorts of things. And I'll explain why. So picture it this way. Infinity must contain a boundary. That doesn't seem like it makes any sense, but it must, because, you know, it contains everything, including the concept of a boundary, but infinity can't be without. So what does exactly that mean? Well, this problem has been solved in quantum mechanics about 100 years ago, and that is that the information inside of infinity and outside of infinity are symmetric, and the difference between them is a time gradient. Now, what people are missing is that a time gradient is the same thing as prioritization. Okay, so let me explain, because I'm going to bring you, the observer, into this explanation, which is going to be a little bit weird, but you'll understand why it's actually necessary just by the laws of identity as I continue. Now, and I also just want to preface this, again, some of you may have already caught into this. A lot of the ideas that I'm talking about are only unintuitive at this stage if you're looking at from our perspective. But if you're looking at it purely from a strictly mathematical perspective, although we're talking something that's more like the preconditions for math, we know that contradictions and irrational things exist in math, in of itself, you know. So, and you know, and exist is a right way to put it, because as we'll get into, information even itself has has virtual weight. So that makes information and the play of information very interesting. Okay, more on that later. So with that boundary, what we call prioritization, the differences between two symmetric entities is that, like, well, this one is now and this one's a context. You know what I mean? This one's just, the only difference is that this one is what will be. You know, when you're looking at between these, this one is actually what allows you to know this one. That's why I'm calling it context. Although we have to hold off calling into a context, because, again, that implies a larger operator outside of it. But anyway, so because this thing is something that always will be, mathematically, we represent that as an orbit or a velocity, you know. And so, and because it is something that is always moving to a stage, that's why we represent it as a wave. But because it's a wave, that also means that its fundamental identity is difference or multiplicity. In some sense, it's pulling itself apart, because infinity must include everything. So this structure that I'm talking about is even really fractally distributed within all of actualization, and the way it contains it is with a sequence. And by sequence, I mean the dimensional expression of the system that we're talking about at this level is a sequence. Yeah, that's what it is in 2 dimensions. You can imagine it like on, off, on, off, on, off. But that in of itself is a problem, again, because, and I've already alluded to this, 2 points can't relate to each other. If you have 2 points, essentially a 2-dimensional structure is unstable. It can't exist. It always collapses in on itself. Because what's the difference between these 2 points? Trying to measure it. Like, what? That doesn't make any sense, because there's nothing else. There's no other context around these. Like, I don't exist within this space. Nothing else exists. So how the distance that there are apart, it's like, what is that? It doesn't exist. So that thing is always something, again, it collapses on in itself because I mean, it's just, I wrote it down. Well, whatever. I think you can understand it already. But because that identity of the boundary is fractally distributed within infinity, and it's literally the structure of a fractal, that's what I'm actually referring to. And it's also a structure of a mathematical and representing a tree, which is really interesting. I was like, oh my God. But anyways, that brings in the concept of God. Because what that structure is when it's stable is something you could say equally includes the potential aspect and the actualization aspect. Although that's information as always. That's like that's a kind of way of saying it. And God is out of it. And then after that description of God, heaven, and earth, then it goes to God, the actualizer over the waters. So that's kind of the total identity. That's the word of God. And then we kind of then fractally move into, that perspective of then how God acts in the world. You see within the sequence, God is actualization over the waters. Now it's fundamentally, it's important to understand like what this structure is when it's fundamentally balanced. It's always moving into itself and moving apart constantly. Now, fundamentally, the identity of actualization always wins, and that's kind of the idea that love extends all the way to hell, and God was let into earth, into hell, and brought a light there. But and we should actually get to what is the concept of light. But let's go one more step here. I just want to make sure we're covering all our bases. So I wrote down some notes, just because there's so many implications, and that's so lovely, It's also new to me. I'm like new to this body. It's like 4 months fucking old. Anyways, it should be understood that it's virtual reflections that surround all of actualizations and multiplicity itself. Its identity is difference, being a wave. The identity can never be pinned down, and therefore multiplicity, it is multiplicity in difference. It should also be understood as a context, but for a context, we need a proper observer, as 2 points alone in of themselves can't relate any relative information to each other. And I get this, I go into that part, I'm going to explain that again. The implications of a boundary in simply the law of identity means that this duality of actualization and potential is fractally distributed within actualization. Uncertainty pulls difference, while actualization calls coherence. And so that's also the manifestation, because these things all get physically represented within our world. Because again, I forget, we've created a structure, we've created reflection, which you can think about consciousness like something reflecting on itself infinitely. And then we've also created genuine bounds for it, and that's basically how do I explain this? Well, I'll get to it. We can understand because we've created infinity, and then outside of infinity is nothing. And then we understand infinity is nothing in an improper way because we're standing within it, and so we can look through this two-dimensional structure and see the 3D, but it's like it's this thing that's unfolding and being differentiated. So it's important to understand. And what exactly where I was going with that? Oh, but so when we see this physically manifested within our world, that's also the dance between female and male. And even, you see these things physically actualized, even the fact that within the dance, women are slightly more what do you say, secretive, in the dance, and men are slightly more, up forward, and they have this sort of, a dance, and it's whatever. Just a phrase of Jordan Peterson is calling to mind right now, where he says, "That's DNA." He was right. But anyways, okay. I'm a ridiculous human being for doing that. Two points. Yes, structure. Okay, so, and then I mentioned that uncertainty pulls difference, while actually pulls coherence. For every two, there are three, And so, by the way, that's all the reason why within this bounded perspective, and like I said, I kind of explained consciousness in this sequence that we have fractal representations of night and day, and also the, I didn't kind of explain this. We'll get into this because there's genuine uncertainty to actualization. It's almost if it's because that pulling and drawing apart, it's creating genuine ripples within actualization. That's also what allows it to genuinely expand and be coming together as it expands over time. Obviously, but and that is the fundamental actualization. Because there's basically, you can think about, because there's uncertainty around the bounds. What was I saying with that? What was it? I'm trying to think of where I was going with that. Uncertainty around the bounds. Well, I was explaining that this was consciousness. What? Whatever. Fuck. I lost my train of thought. I smoke before doing these for certain reasons. Maybe you guys already get the point, and that's why I need to stop. Okay, anyways. Well, did I explain that's why you have night and day within this reflection? That's why we have those things. That's what I was saying. It's like you have this bounded thing where you have a sequence. And I was explaining why you have. I was going to explain why we have branches. Oh. Okay, whatever. The first thing. So why is there order for you? First thing, understand that information I've delineated must be represented at higher levels of constraint. You know what I mean? I've talked about that. Like Shakespeare can't break the laws of physics. You can't read a play. You know what I mean? That wouldn't make sense. Degree. Okay, yeah. Whenever I mentioned that, collapsing back to the volatility. That's what I was talking about. So because there's genuine uncertainty around the bounds, like what exactly can be drawn into actualization is basically in a probability space within that fundamental sort of like within that fundamental word of God that I described at the beginning, that fractal. So like as things can go outside of that pattern, but they sort of have to coherently snap back. And by the way, the structure I'm describing, you shouldn't be understanding it because like God is sort of an operator outside of this thing. It has an unfolding structure. You know what I mean? His identity is just actualization in and of itself. We should be understanding the structure as something outside of time. I mentioned this before. I actually really like the metaphor of an editor because there is even a genuine aspect to, the interest pulling in the structure, to begin with, in some sense. I mean, interest. Maybe I don't mean interest. I mean, it's a fire. Climax. What do you describe the drama with that movie with the meat? You know what I mean? What do you describe that? Okay. But again, that would actually call the entire structure to be, and you have this sort of thing. I mean, you would never know it because you're in the film, but where you need to change things out at the end to make things in the right now happen make sense. Like if you put 2025 smacked it against the year 1000, there'd be no coherence there. You'd look at each other. The only coherence would really be Christ, to be honest. But you look at each other and be like, what the fuck? And honestly, more so because as time goes on and people go to sleep, we genuinely give up information, and that allows us to include more things, you know. And did I also mention that what surrounds us is also just genuine reflections, you know? And then those reflections have reflections too, you know what I mean? Because it's like fractal, so that's what's your virtual, you know, the thoughts are, you know, these waves, you know. Also, you need to explain between this dynamic. We need to be thinking about. Well, you know, let's just continue on this line. So, because God has a stable existence outside of heaven and earth, yet earth is always collapsing into actualization, and given earth is multiplicitous in nature as both what was and what will be, an unpinned down state of travel or wave, this creates genuine volatility, and that volatility collapses into the most coherent state. So did I explain that properly? Because it's what's outside of it is genuine difference. That allows genuine play within the system, but it always mathematically must snap back within some ratio of itself, basically, and continue to do that. And that's sort of like, again, that's the fractal image. And you can imagine that, you know, if you're doing heads a million times, at some point it must reach tails. But even more so, the proportion of tails, in some sense, is what gives identity to how many times you just rolled heads, because the heads in that sense would be basically just a wave. Before those bounds are dropped. And by the way, this structure that I'm also describing describes what a number line is, because the number line is that stable identity, but inside, you know, you look inside and there's infinities and you know, contradictions, and that zero number line between infinity and positive and negative infinity is actually what is fractally distributed to make up the wave of the other identity, and a really complex wave, because we use that to represent reality, and all the time. This is going to seem unintuitive at first, but it's correct. All the time in reality, things from outside of our simulation sort of, from within our simulation sort of come in and update it. Imagine if you had like a Turing machine that modeled the whole world, and like a bird flew into it and gave an answer it couldn't give before. You know what I mean? And if that information had a coherence that related to you, that would be, well, that's always true, I guess you could say. And it's the outside world reflecting on your internal model, you could say, because it's already modeling the world, but, you know, there's always gaps, you know, and that's that sort of it never completely breaks though, you know. Sorry, that's a bad analogy. I made that analogy to actually explain something else, but it's still interesting to think about. I think proper. Okay, I'm gonna go inside. I think we talked about enough for right now. Okay. When Adam's daydream reaches an end, he collapses into uncertainty, he becomes a passive receiver, and uncertainty. Yeah, listening is a form of divination, because it's like it's waves from the outside, basically, and those waves fundamentally fade into the metaphysical. If you made a machine that could simulate all of reality, because it's doing averages of reality, and the patterns of reality fundamentally turn in on themselves, and you're averaging waves that throughout time fade into the metaphysical in both directions, or fade into the metaphysical in both directions. It won't be able to model its own reflection, basically. And, you know, unless it's worshiping God. I don't know. Actually, I didn't think about that. Yeah. But yeah, anyway, so you can think about this fundamental symmetric identity. It's like the fire self-actualizing process pulling out virtual potential to, like, say, like, you know, this is the path we're going. Over the waters, doing that with these penetrating waves, you know. Or you could think about it on the other side, yourself in the fires, you know. I guess in that sense, it actually makes more sense to refer to both as basically being wheat, maybe. But the fire around you, basically, yeah, actually, because we're talking about actualization, so that's why they use wheat examples. I'm thinking about it, because like the water actually does work, because when you sleep, you coarse grain. But you know, but that's a different example, so you have to use the wheat examples to make it be coherent. But yeah, so the fire, basically, as your distance moves from God because of just coherence, you know, burning you towards repentance, basically. You know, and those are two ways of describing the exact same thing, because that fire is also dividing you. You know, fire is actually what's it doing, is taking nature and simplifying things, and there's a destructive element, deeply destructive element to fire, you know. Well, because fire is unbalanced without the managing principles of us, just like water is, you know. All these things are, but water is a relaxed thing, you know. In water, will just always just sit there, versus fire, you know, it has to feed, and it has a direction, and it, you know, it's, like I said, it's self-actualization itself. And objects themselves actually manifest as fire. Like, imagine a car over time, and like the identity of a car would sort of flicker out as it moved into water, you know. So these are things, just everything people should think about. So I didn't talk about trees that much. I made a video trying to talk about trees. I haven't talked about trees that much. I'm doing that when I'm talking to birds. Anyways, bless you guys. Thank you.